Okay, welcome to EMDR Therapy 101 with Dr. Dansiger. I'm going to introduce Bob Cornell, who's the president of NAMI Southwest Connecticut, and he'll start this.
All right, very good. Well, thank you, Susie. Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's speaker event. This event is brought to you, of course, by your local affiliate of NAMI, of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, which serves Lower Fairfield County. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving the quality of life for individuals and families living with a mental health condition. I would just like to inform or perhaps remind everyone of NAMI Southwest free services. We offer two types of confidential support groups, Friends and Family, which is for family members of adults, and NAMI CAM for parents and caregivers of children and adolescents. We also offer free evidence-based classes. There's a family-to-family class, an educational program for family and friends of adults, and NAMI Basics for families of children. We have an ongoing speaker series like the one tonight, and a book club that meets every other month. In fact, those interested in continuing this conversation on this topic, this coming Monday night, the book club will meet at 7 o'clock on Zoom to talk about The Body Keeps the Score, a best-selling book which also discusses EMDR therapy. So I encourage you to visit our website for more information about us at NAMI Southwest CT.org. And as always, I encourage you all to join NAMI. So now let me introduce Dr. Dansiger, who will be talking to us tonight. Dr. Steve is the author of several books and founders of companies who blogs and podcasts on the topics related to mental health, recovery and mindfulness. Dr. Steve is also a master EMDR therapist and trainer. So Steve, I'd like to turn it over to you. Thank you. I think you're on mute, Steve.
How about that?
Perfect.
Getting started with my Zoom presentation in a muted way. So anyway, what I did say was, welcome everyone. Very good to see you all. Glad you all took some time out to learn a little bit about EMDR therapy. And my hope is that I can give you even a little bit more than a snapshot of the history of EMDR therapy and what it might mean, what it might be able to do for you or a loved one, and also to answer any questions that you have as we get to the end of things. So let me just go ahead and start sharing my screen right now. And are you seeing it okay? Okay, I see one. I got one good head nod, so I know we're good. So the reason for the title is that, again, my hope is that at least some of the basics, at least some of what will give you enough of an understanding to be able to feel like you can do more research, right, and see what EMDR therapy might be able to provide. And you know, for some of you, you might have heard about it in a cursory way. Some of you may actually have had some EMDR therapy. Some of you may know someone who's been in EMDR therapy. So my hope is that I can provide you with a bolstered set of information. So let me start by just letting you know who's in the room with you. I'm going to try and not stay here too long. But just so you know, like with anything else, I don't know, my hope is when I'm listening to a presentation or going to a talk, my hope is that the person is pretty passionate about things. And I'm very, very passionate about EMDR therapy. And it comes from a long history of my own. It's actually not listed here. It's funny. Usually we do list it. So I've been in my own personal recovery from addiction for 33 years now. And that's what started my journey towards, getting help for my own mental health issues. Before that, I had gotten some cursory help, but for the most part, my journey really started when I found recovery. And I personally found it at first in 12-step programs, and then with many different types of folks and modalities. And one of those was I was brought to a 12-step retreat at a Zen Buddhist monastery in upstate New York, actually. I'm from New York originally. And I was brought to this monastery where I got my first mindfulness lesson. So I've been sitting mindfulness meditation for over 30 years and teaching it for about 25. And another thing that occurred as a result of that is that I actually lived at that monastery for a year. I almost ordained and just kept going. And one of the ways I like to frame that is I did that so you don't have to. We meditated for 4.5 hours a day on a regular day. On retreat days, it was more. And what I learned from that is I was able to learn that I don't need to meditate 4.5 hours a day to get the benefits. So my talk today is not about mindfulness in particular, but know that mindfulness is infused in everything that I do. And I'll say a little bit about it as it pertains to EMDR therapy, because it actually is one of the mechanisms of action. And it's one of the ways that our team practices and teaches EMDR therapy. So I've taught those classes. I also had a 15-year career as a social justice, diversity, inclusion educator. That came out of my being a high school teacher in Crown Heights, Brooklyn in the early 90s when there was racial unrest there. And it led to me getting trained and moving into that career, which had a huge impact on me in terms of my journey towards becoming a therapist, since what I learned about was the trauma, aspect of those issues and what people go through as a result of, racism and systemic oppression and such. And so, so that's there. And I'm a regular presenter at the EMDR International Association conferences. So I'm very involved in trying to do what I'm doing tonight, which is to, let people know that EMDR therapy is there and available. I created a protocol called Meta that is a systemic way of utilizing mindfulness and EMDR in treatment centers and also in mental health primary centers and other organizations where the principles and the practices of EMDR actually expand and help people to be able to, for the most part, one of the major things that we try to do with that is helping clinicians and other helpers and healers to take care of themselves, because that's a huge issue, the issue of burnout and the issue of just being able to take care of oneself in the difficult work of being a helper. And so I'll wrap this up by saying that I've been training people in EMDR therapy since 2015. I've been an EMDR therapist since 2005. In 2005, when I got trained in EMDR therapy, I made the decision to make it my primary way of doing my work. So what I do day to day is I'm an EMDR therapist. So, and then the books that I've co-written 2 books on EMDR therapy that are pointed towards clinicians and their work, although they do have, I've heard some folks who are not clinicians say they had some help for them there. One is about EMDR therapy and mindfulness, and the more recent one is on healing addiction with EMDR therapy. I've also written about mindfulness and anger management and clinician and helper self-care. And lastly, part of a series of books that my colleague Jamie Marich authored, the first one called Trauma and the 12 Steps. And that volume or those volumes are actually very helpful or have been found very helpful for folks who are both in 12-step recovery and also in some kind of trauma therapy, whether it be EMDR therapy or something else. So, so here's what I'm going to try and touch on today. I'd like to, just again, give an overview of what EMDR therapy is and what the approach of EMDR therapy is. In other words, what are the mechanics of it, but then what also, what are the goals, the objectives, or where does it go once it starts? How does it work? When we talk about how does EMDR therapy work, those of you who spend any amount of time studying about the brain and studying about neuroscience know that, I think we used to all say, that neuroscience was in its infancy. I feel like it's becoming a toddler. It's moving on. And so a lot of what we know and see is largely theoretical, but more and more information is coming in all the time. So, and so then I'm going to talk to you about the 8-phase protocol of EMDR therapy. And EMDR therapy is a structured, and we like to say structured but not rigid, but structured therapy that has 8 phases to it and is meant to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So I can give you, again, a sort of an overview, a snapshot of those 8 phases, which, just so you know, those of you who've been in psychotherapy before, a lot of the elements of a lot of different psychotherapies are within that 8-phase protocol. So when you look at EMDR therapy, you're not looking at something completely unfamiliar. There's, it's a very integrated and integrative therapy. And Francine Shapiro, who created the therapy, she drew from a lot of spiritual and psychological and therapeutic traditions to create the therapy. Then we'll talk about a little bit who can be helped by EMDR therapy. And, sometimes, people come in with, claims that it can do this, it can do that, or, anything can do this or that. And just so you know, there's a lot of research to back up a broad array of difficulties that people can get help for using EMDR therapy. We'll talk about some of the common myths. Again, some of you might come with some previous knowledge or have heard a story or two about it. And there are a number of myths that not only in our community do we have to take time to talk to the public about, but actually, within the EMDR therapy clinical community, there's myths that that have built up over the years that are good to look at and see how mythical they are. So, and then lastly, a little bit about how EMDR is different from other therapies. We'll talk about all the similarities too, but how is it different? So let's start with what EMDR therapy is. And I'll just read, these words come from the EMDR International Association as part of their definition of EMDR therapy. EMDRIA has been in place or has existed since Shapiro created therapy in the late 80s. So it's an evidence-based structured therapy that encourages the client to briefly focus on the trauma memory while simultaneously experiencing bilateral stimulation, which does not always come in the form of eye movements. It can be in the form of eye movements, or it could be tactile, like back and forth buzzies, or it could be audio tones back and forth. So I'll say a little bit more about that when I talk about the history of EMDR therapy and why it's called EMDR rather than something else. And it is an 8-phase approach designed to resolve unprocessed traumatic memories in the brain. And actually, you can really extend that out a little bit. And The Body Keeps the Score was mentioned, and the fact that Bessel van der Kolk, the author of Body Keeps the Score, in that book talks about EMDR therapy and continues to speak about EMDR therapy as a top-line therapy for PTSD in particular, but also for other difficulties. And so how does it do what it does, or what are we focused on when we're doing EMDR therapy? It doesn't just target the past experience. One of the things, I spend a lot of time talking to clinicians. I'm training clinicians most weeks out of the year. So when we're talking to our clinicians, one of the things that we highlight is that EMDR therapy targets the past experience, but also the current triggers and the future potential challenges. In other words, when we talk about bringing a maladaptively stored memory to an adaptive resolution, what we mean is we have brought it to an adaptive resolution that results in the past isn't coming at me anymore. The current triggers or triggers that have been triggering my difficulties no longer have that ability to trigger me. And the future fears I've been holding that come from those difficult past experiences are now resolved as well. And so we talk about how we're not done with our work until we've dealt with the past, the present, and the future. And so, like other therapies, it does result in the alleviation of the presenting symptoms, right? Like folks who come to EMDR therapy often get some really nice symptom relief early on in the therapy. And then as the therapy goes on and we get more into the deeper reprocessing phases, we can see a decrease or elimination of distress from the disturbing memory or memories. And then you see those larger gains or those larger results that we're looking for when we're looking to heal, an improved view of the self, relief from bodily disturbance. I don't know about you, but a lot of times my psychological or spiritual, emotional challenges result in stuff going on with my body. And a lot of times folks come into EMDR therapy primarily presenting with, physical stuff, right? Headaches or GI issues, etc. And so if and when those difficulties are related, turns out they're related to trauma or traumatic memories, then that bodily disturbance is relieved. And then a resolution of present and future anticipated triggers, right? I know, one of the things that I'm dealing with in my house is I have a 13-year-old daughter, and she's developed some pretty solid social anxiety, or it's been building. And so the work that we do together, parent to child, and also she has a therapist, and so much of her work is about seeing if there's a way or ways to deal with the future anticipated triggers, because it's almost all anticipatory anxiety. And so that's one of the things I love about EMDR therapy is that we're really, we're acknowledging that the past is kind of following us around. And then we're also acknowledging that we may have to do dedicated work to heal that future fear stuff, even if we've dealt with the past, that we're pointing our work in all those directions. So one of the things that attracted me to EMDR therapy when I did get trained, so the people who get trained in EMDR therapy need to be master's level and above clinicians, right? So it's a psychotherapy, and folks are trained after they've had all their other training, right? And so one of the things that attracted me was the research base, that it really, Francine Shapiro, who created the therapy, she was obsessed with research. If you ever had the opportunity to meet her, she passed away in June of 2019. And I did have the opportunity to email with her and to meet her. She would always say to you, get the data, no matter what you told her, this happened and that happened, she would get the data. And because of that, that is the sort of culture of the EMDR therapy community. So it's been extensively researched. It's an effective psychotherapy method, proven to help people recover from trauma and PTSD symptoms. And I've said the word trauma a number of times. I should probably right now start the talk about when I say trauma, I'm talking about the wide continuum of human experience, meaning that originally Shapiro used terms big T trauma and small t trauma, right? Because her original premise, her theory was this will be effective with things that don't check the boxes for diagnosable post-traumatic stress disorder, right? That those things that any individual might define as having been traumatic, but don't meet criterion A events for PTSD diagnosis would heal with this approach as well. And that has borne out over time. And then what happened in 2014 was that Dr. Shapiro said, please, we're not going to use big T trauma and small t trauma anymore. Now we're going to use trauma and adverse life events, right? And so my continuum of trauma and adverse life events, just to give an example, right, is like, trauma is old age, sickness, and death, and all the other really the big stuff. And then there's lots of other big stuff there too. And then over here, adverse life events like out here in LA, traffic on the 405. I know we have our East Coast equivalents, right? Like that traffic on the 405, I could be, I could just be, okay, I'm sitting in traffic, I turn up the music, or that traffic on the 405 can rattle me, right? Or I have when I wake up and my kid doesn't want to go to school, right? That could be World War III, or that could just be, okay, honey, we'll work this out, right? So anything that has that valence that allows for the possibility that my internal workings, my internal system could get activated, right? So I'm giving you the all the way on the opposite end of the spectrum, right? Traffic, and then move it up a little bit, like bullying, or move it up to, difficulties with, medical difficulties that are chronic, ongoing, chronic pain that may not be so bad, but it's just enough that every day I'm kind of like working through and dealing with this chronic pain. And so that's adverse life events. And the reason why I bring out this discussion now is to say that EMDR therapy addresses not just those big T traumas or trauma, it also addresses the results that happen to me because of adverse life events. And a lot of that was Dr. Shapiro's doing, where she said, it's not about the nature of the event, it's about what happened to the person, right? So I can have an effect on me from something that didn't have an effect on you. You could even look at it from big T trauma, right? I remember, I was living still in New York when 9/11 happened, right? And I still can't do the math on why and how it was that this person got PTSD and that person didn't, because it didn't always match the profile. So knowing that, even big T trauma events can have different effects on different people. So we're looking more squarely at the person rather than the thing that happened to determine whether it's something that we can get help for with EMDR therapy. And so the second bullet point here, there's successful outcomes well documented in the literature of other psychiatric disorders besides post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder, the World Health Organization declared it evidence-based for PTSD in 2013, and also for phobias. And so the literature is growing extensively around anxiety, depression, OCD, addictions, and then somatic symptoms or disorders such as chronic pain. So it's being used in a variety of ways, and it's a global phenomenon in terms of the amount of research and practice that's going on. And so as a result, a number of organizations see it as an effective treatment. The NAMI, for one, both APAs, the American Psychiatric and the American Psychological Association, the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, SAMHSA, Veterans Affairs, and the World Health Organization. And also, I'm aware, besides the Department of Veterans Affairs, all of the different branches of the military, the list of therapies that are approved for use with veterans and active duty for PTSD are trauma-focused CBT, exposure, and EMDR therapy. So the research is there and the practice is there, and And again, that was part of what attracted me to it, because I'm not a scientist first. I came to, becoming a therapist through my own lived experience, and then my career as an educator. And then also, I love the science, but wasn't my strong suit. So when I found a therapy that was well researched, I was like, someone did that, to make me, to embolden me in my walk moving forward with it. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of EMDR therapy and a couple of reasons why. First of all, I find it to be a wonderful story, and it's a wonderful story of someone trying to heal themselves and discovering a healing modality that then went on to help, probably millions of people thus far. And what happened was Dr. Shapiro was a psychologist, and she had a strong behaviorist background and a research background as well. And she was diagnosed with cancer. And as she went through her getting help and treatment for her cancer, she wasn't getting all the results she wanted from just the medical field. And so she went on a very dedicated mind, body, spirit. She started to seek those kind of different ways of healing. And so through that, she found, and this is something that, I only got to know for sure in 2015, was that she got mindfulness training as part of her search. And she actually got mindfulness training from a mindfulness teacher named Stephen Levine. He passed away in 2015, and he gave her mindfulness training, and she did not tell all of us in the EMDR community and further outside it that she had a mindfulness practice when she had this discovery during her walk in the park, because back in 1987, when this was all happening, there was literally only one article in the clinical literature about mindfulness being a clinical intervention. So she kind of kept it close to the vest for years, and we all kind of thought it was true, and then we found out it was true. She finally told us. In any case, she was basically taking a walk in the park, and as she was walking through the park, she was having a negative thought about her cancer, right? Like, oh, am I ever going to get through this? And she also noticed that as she was walking through the park, her eyes were tracking the environment, which our eyes do, right? We rarely just stare straight ahead as we're walking. And in this case, she noticed that her eyes were tracking kind of rapidly, right? And because she had the mindfulness practice, she had the thought that mindfulness practitioners have of, I should probably pay attention to this and see what this is about. And so she noticed the eye movements, and then eventually she was, I don't know, either bored with them or they just kind of weren't so present for her. And when she was done with the eye movements, she noticed that the thought about the cancer really wasn't there anymore. Or it wasn't really charged anymore. She's like, oh, that's weird. Let me see if that's a thing. And so she on purpose brought up another negative thought and moved her eyes back and forth rapidly. And the same thing happened. She was like, that's strange. So she went back to where she was living. She had this sort of guest house, main house arrangement with this other psychologist, AJ Popke. And she said, can I try something with you? And he's, yeah, let's do it. And she's like, think of something terrible. He said, okay. And I'm going to move my fingers in front of your face and follow my fingers. And he did, and he didn't feel as charged anymore. So again, literally, that's how EMDR therapy was first brought to possibly becoming something. And so her thought was she had maybe come up with some kind of natural Valium without the side effects, right? Like that it would sort of just calm the mind down somehow. So she created it originally as eye movement desensitization, EMD. Because she didn't notice the reprocessing part at first. She just noticed people felt better, right? Like symptom relief. And then she also then started to do it with more people. And as she did it with more people, and she did her first study, and with her first study, she decided, let me try it with people with diagnosed PTSD, because if it works for that, it'll probably work for things that are less painful or less difficult. And so her first research study was with sexual assault survivors and Vietnam War vets, and the results were great. And as she went forward, a couple of things. One was a sight impaired person came into her office, and she's like, oh man, this person's not going to be able to track the eye movements. So she just instinctively tapped on their knees in the same kind of cadence that we do the eye movements, and the therapy worked. And so that's where she discovered it wasn't as much about eye movements in particular, but more about the bilateral stimulation, whether it became tactile or audio tones or through the eye movements. And so in the beginning, actually right through the early 2000s, Dr. Shapiro faced a lot of pushback from, other therapy communities. The trauma therapy community was not as robust as it is now. And so she was a little bit out kind of on her own in some ways in focusing in on the primacy of trauma and adverse life events as driving the difficulties that folks have. And also, people were just, what's this with the eye movements, right? And so again, if Shapiro hadn't been as much of a research person as she was, I don't know if we'd be sitting here talking to each other. I'm very grateful to her spirit and her persistence in, making sure that she hadn't put together something that didn't do what she hoped it would do. So the approach of EMDR therapy. So EMDR therapy views trauma, or the reaction/response to trauma, as the primary problem, or at the very least as a primary problem. And the way she summarized this was, she basically said that if the problem that comes into my office, for instance, the problem that the person comes into the office with is not organic, right? Like a biological thing, or if it's not the result of insufficient information, as in I don't know everything about what I'm looking at in terms of the difficulty, then it is most often the effects of the incomplete processing and storage of events, memories, and sensations. In other words, that's our default, right? Similar to if you think about CBT, the thought is that the difficulty is produced by faulty beliefs that have developed over time, and then we're going to have to work on those beliefs. And in fact, here Shapiro says that the problem is the reaction, the response, and the incomplete processing and the poor linkage of memories that come from trauma. So the maladaptive processing and storage of the memory needs to be brought to an adaptive resolution for the person to get better. So the way we do that is we stimulate the brain in ways that includes the bilateral stimulation that leads it to process the unprocessed or unhealed memories. And when we say unhealed or unprocessed, what we mean is we have the three parts of the brain, the neocortex, the cognitive, the neocortex. We have the limbic brain, the emotional brain that developed during early mammalian evolution. And we have the brainstem, or that which we share with reptiles, right? And so what happens is that when things go correctly, when the adaptive information processing system works as it should, what happens is that the brain sounds the alarm, the amygdala and the limbic brain sounds the alarm. We do fight, flight, or freeze. And then eventually, after a period of time, usually, let's say an hour, where the cortisol drains out and the adrenaline dies down and the body kind of shakes it out, then the person has the memory delivered, let's say, to their neocortex, where they can say, oh, that happened, and it's not happening now. So an unhealed or unprocessed memory, that stuff gets stuck in the limbic system, in the brains, in the nervous system, in the body, right? And so what we do with EMDR therapy is we bring a person to a natural restoration and an adaptive resolution. We lead them to a decreased emotional charge. That's the desensitization, and a linkage to positive memory networks, which is the reprocessing part. And again, how did it go from EMD to EMDR? What happened is that Shapiro already was in the literature as EMD, and when she discovered the reprocessing, she's like, oh man, I got to just stick the R on there. She said in a documentary many years later that if she was able to do it all over again, she would have just called it reprocessing therapy, because that was the main event, right? So EMDR helps people address and work through these memories, sensations, and emotions and resume normal, adaptive, healthy processing, right? Because the old stuff being unprocessed has an impact on how well we're able to process what's going on now. So when we go through EMDR therapy, an experience that may have triggered a negative response in the past may no longer affect them the way it used to after EMDR treatment. Difficult experiences will likely become less upsetting. An example I use in my trainings a lot is, for instance, someone who went through a trauma, perhaps combat or some other trauma where like loud sounds, were involved, right? And let's say I'm walking down the street and a car backfires, right? So I don't think to myself, well, it's 2022, but you can never be so careful. I better dive for cover, right? The person who has that unhealed, untreated memory that is still kind of more in their body, more in their emotional brain, not in a place of storage where I can put a timestamp on it and make meaning of it and say, oh, that happened and it's not happening now. That brain is saying, it's happening again. Right? So they're diving for cover as if they're back where they were, that kind of thing. And then a person goes through EMDR treatment, that person will not have their startle response removed, right? That would be a bad thing, right? We need to have that response. But the loud sound the car would backfire, the person would be like, whoa, and then they'd be able to go, oh, yeah, I'm in the street here in Los Angeles. It is 2022. It's probably a car backfiring. I'm okay. And even if they have, some of the increased heart rate and all of that, they're able to take care of themselves and dial it down, and they don't get taken away and brought back to the earlier difficult experience. So EMDR therapy has a unique to it set of procedures and clinical protocols, which helps us to do this by putting together the dual focus of attention, right? I'm bringing up the memory, the bad memory that I have, at the same time that I'm doing this bilateral stimulation. And what happens is that eventually, and there's a number of different ways that I can describe this, and if I have time, I'll give you a couple of the, well, actually I can do that right now because I think I have plenty of time in terms of my plan. So for instance, there's a number of different theories as to how this works, why the bilateral stimulation stimulates the reprocessing of the memory. And the first theory that Shapiro had, that's still one of the theories we operate from, is that it's mimicking REM sleep, right? That those eye movements are like a waking version of REM sleep or the bilateral stimulation, which in the past we used to think, well, the person is watching the dreamscape, when in fact, it's this very primitive part of the reptilian brain aspect of the data dump that's going on while people are sleeping, right? When we're sleeping during the REM cycle, that's where a lot of memories are just ditched. And then the ones that are going to go to the long-term memory are delivered, through the medium-term memory to the long-term memory, et cetera. So that we're stimulating that action. Another theory is that it is similar to the orienting response of an animal in the wild, constantly checking to see that they're okay. Like if I'm a deer in the forest having some grass for food, and then I hear something and I'll look up because, who knows if there's a predator around, and I look up and it's the wind blowing through the trees, boring, right? And that's the way it is 98 times out of 100, right? And then let's say one time out of 100, there could be oh my gosh, that's the most attractive deer I've ever seen, right? The excitement go towards. And then one time out of 100, let's say it's a bear, right? So I run and let's say I get away, right? It takes about an hour for the adrenaline. Like I said earlier, the adrenaline, the cortisol, you might even see the deer shake, right? As it kind of releases. And then after that, it is not on my couch 5 years later talking about the bear incident, right? It's not at the bar that night talking about the bear incident. It's basically munching on grass. And it's also not looking up 102 times an hour, right? Still looking up 100 times an hour, right? To make sure it's okay, right? And so what happens is that, the good news, bad news of us being human beings with our neocortex, right? The neocortex could say, wow, that was terrible. I'm never going to think about that again, which is impossible. So the memory sits somewhere else, the body or the emotional brain. Or the brain might say, the person might say, well, that was terrible. I better be looking for that everywhere all the time, right? Hypervigilance, right? Another symptom of PTSD and other difficulties. So the theory there is that this bilateral stimulation is the equivalent of the 98 times out of 100 where it's no threat. And so we bring up the threat and do this at the same time. And eventually it comes to the neocortex where I can say, boring, wind through the trees, right? It doesn't mean, and that's another thing, it doesn't mean that I'll no longer have an opinion about it, right? If it was a terrible thing, but it won't be coming at me in that same way and making my current life painful. So how does it work? I've actually said a little bit about that in terms of the way that traumatic memories are dealt with, or trauma is dealt with by the brain. The amygdala, which is the alarm signal, the hippocampus, which assists in learning, including memories about safety and danger, and then the prefrontal cortex, which can analyze and control behavior and emotion. It's where we have our uniquely human characteristics. So while many times traumatic experiences can be managed and resolved spontaneously, in other words, these systems work, and even if there's been a threat, and even if I don't have a significant amount of help in that moment, I still may be able to process it through to where I'm aware that it's no longer happening and that it is simply a memory. But many times, folks, certainly folks who come to me for help are dealing with more than one memory that is stuck in the wrong place, as it were. So again, a little bit more about how EMDR therapy, how trauma affects the brain, how EMDR therapy affects the brain. The stress responses that we have, the fight, flight, or freeze, are natural and needed, right? Like they're about survival. And some of you might be familiar with the work of Gabor Mate, who, in the addiction world is talking so much about how when people develop an addiction, often it is very adaptive. I can even speak to that for myself. Like when I was 12 years old and I started to use substances, it was my solution, right? It was my solution to some trauma that had happened, and it worked, right? So at the time, it was adaptive, right? And then over time, it becomes, it turns against me. But the point being that, fight, flight, or freeze and the responses that come with that, that's our surviving, right? So when distress from a disturbing event remains, the upsetting images, thoughts, and emotions may create an overwhelming feeling of being back in that moment or being frozen in time. So that distress can be just kind of living there and every now and then pops up internally, and or it could be affected, like the example I gave of the car backfiring, right? External circumstances or events can trigger those old thoughts, emotions, images, and sensations. So what EMDR therapy does, it helps the brain to process these memories through to where they are still remembered, but the fight, flight, or freeze response from the original event is resolved. So I'm no longer reacting and responding from that place. So one of the things that why it has its own slide is because this is one of the things that I love about EMDR therapy. And this is my original trainer, Dr. Andrew Leeds, said to me many times, said to us many times, he said, EMDR therapy is a treatment. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Folks come to you for help, they get the help, and then they thank you. And I like to say they go to live their fabulous lives, right? And so a lot of what drives that is the model that Shapiro came up with to both explain and also show us as clinicians how to do EMDR therapy and what it is that's happening in EMDR therapy. And this is the model that says much of psychopathology is due to this maladaptive encoding of and or incomplete processing of traumatic memories. And she didn't create it in a vacuum. It's a learning and memory-based model that goes back to a number of different folks that she referenced in order to create this model, to understand what it was that was happening with EMDR therapy. She originally called it the accelerated processing model because the first thing that she noticed, another first thing she noticed, was just how fast the reprocessing happened. And her and folks around her, including Vanderkolk, at the very beginning were like, man, maybe it's even too fast. But that's why the rest of the protocol was built the way that it was. And I'm going to explain that in a moment. So I said this earlier, it's a very important aspect of it, is that the 8-phase protocol is structured but not rigid, right? In other words, it's not cookie cutter. We're not doing the same exact thing with each and every person, in as much as we realize, or let's put it this way, it's a client-centered therapy. It's a collaborative therapy. It's an empowering therapy for the client. And it has these great guardrails in the form of the 8-phase protocol. And not only that, the 8-phase protocol also, there's integrations and adaptations where they're clinically indicated, right? So, like I said, not cookie cutter. Let me give you a snapshot of the 8 phases. So, first phase is history taking, and a lot of what happens in phase 1, if you've been in therapy before, may actually seem very familiar and similar, right? We're building rapport. Any major study on psychotherapy in general has always come back with the relationship as the primary thing. So that's by the way, that's one of the myths of EMDR therapy, that it's a cold clinical exercise that a robot therapist could do by, doing this, right? And the fact is, it's very relational. The thing that's different in terms of the history taking and the way that we approach it is, one of the first things that I say to my clients when they come to me is I'll say, you don't have to tell me your whole story for me to help you, right? Like a lot of times you'll come in, and first thing you'll do with a therapist is, here's the story, right? And here's the reason. The way that we're going to treat the memories that are related to the history that we find is not about the narrative, but it's about the event, and then working event by event, right? So, just for instance, when I'm working with someone in the beginning, I basically ask them for newspaper headlines, and they don't even have to give me the whole thing. Like, they can say something as vague as that thing that happened when I was 12, and I'll just write that down. And then we'll put it off to the side because we're working in a phased method here, right? So in history taking, our goal is to get the history without triggering the person as much as possible, right? Because we're not reprocessing yet. So the way that we do this is through really doing thematic history taking. Like we don't say, give me the whole chronology, because a lot of people don't have a chronology available, nor do we need it to provide this therapy, right? So we work with, like I said, that this has a lot of elements of different therapies. So similar to CBT, or the CBT aspect, we work with negative beliefs about self, and we use those negative beliefs about self to discover some parts of the history that we may not get from just having a talk with each other. It's very interesting. We float back off of a negative belief about self and find things. And I'll just share something from my own therapy, right? When I had my own EMDR therapy, and one of my negative beliefs about myself was I'm not good enough, right? And so I had a couple of events in my life that someone, if I told them to you, you would say, oh, that's I could see how that could happen. I'm not good enough. But when I went back in my memory, just thinking about this, I'm not good enough, I found a memory from when I was like 8 years old. And my dad was my coach. He was that great coach who everyone played and everyone had a good time. He never gave me a hard time, ever, like, win or lose, except this one time where it was like, the playoff game, and I lost. I was the pitcher, and I came off the field, and I remember he looked at me like, you effed that up, kid. And it was lost in my memory system, right? Because it wasn't so dramatic. And we found it. And the fact is that as I went through the therapy further, I realized that was a huge part of my I'm not good enough scaffolding. So the reason why we do history this way is that some of a person's history may be unavailable or not feel safe enough to work on yet, right? Like people come in ready to talk about one subject and not about the other. And we honor that in EMDR therapy. So phase 2 is about stabilization, but more importantly, preparation. And when we say preparation, we're preparing folks to do this reprocessing work. And so resources, that's a term that we use in trauma therapy in general, but in EMDR therapy in particular, are anything and everything that is healthy and adaptive for the client that I'm working with. Meaning that we're looking for internal and external resources, things that help the person to soothe their central nervous system. So it could be anything from mindfulness to exercise to relationships to mutual help programs to church to anything and everything. Some of those resources are the person's resources as they navigate life, and some of them are the ones that we can use in the office together, right, to help them to learn how to do to do self-regulation. So those two phases, phase 1 looks a little different, and phase 2 might look a little different in how intentional it is about building skills. But in the end, they kind of look like other therapies in some ways. And then we get to phases 3 through 6, which myself and my co-author, Jamie Marich, when we did our Healing Addiction book, we wanted to call the chapter on these phases Shapiro's Special Sauce. And so we did, and we were totally convinced they would cross it out. And they didn't. So the chapter is Shapiro's Special Sauce. Anyway, this is her very unique aspect. These are the reprocessing phases. And the way they go is phase 3, we basically activate all the aspects of the memory briefly and quickly. And then we go into the eye movements or the other stimulation, phase 4, to desensitizing. So the point being, one of the points being that we're only activating memory and sort of bringing on the distress for a very short period of time in order to get things started. And then immediately we're working towards relief. And then phase 5 is called installation. And essentially, when the memory is now rated by the client at a 0 out of 10 in terms of distress, we're not satisfied to leave it there. We then link it to a positive belief about self to strengthen, how the memory is experienced now on the more positive side of the scale. And one sort of thing I can tell you, actually, let me talk about phase 6 real quickly first. And then the last thing we do after that linking to a positive belief is we check the body to see if there's any residual things that we need to desensitize or reprocess. And then it's considered complete. And a lot of times at the end of a session like that, the client will report, they may come in like a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10, and it's just images and sounds and this and that. And at the end, they'll say something to the effect of, it's like a black and white picture. It's about a few feet in front of me. I see that it's me. I see it's that event, and it just isn't charged anymore. And I realize that I'm safe now. So phase 7 is closure, which essentially is, if you go for EMDR therapy, you will, the last 10 minutes will never be about reprocessing. It'll be about, we've done some really great work. What do you want to do? What do you need to do to transition from this session back into your day-to-day, the rest of your day? Because we don't want to leave someone activated, right? And then reevaluation phase 8 basically refers to everything that's happening in between sessions, right? Reprocessing may continue, right? And we've worked out a plan with our client, to be able to self-regulate during in between sessions. And so know that EMDR therapy is a very integrated and complete psychotherapy. It had a reputation at times for being kind of like a technique, when in fact it's a whole psychotherapy. Another thing World Health Organization did in 2013 was to add it to its list of complete psychotherapies that have a definition and a method and a model. One of my favorite quotes from Shapiro is the purpose of EMDR therapy is to help people live a more adaptive life, right? So think of it this way, for instance. This therapy is not, and the goal of trauma therapy is not Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind or Men in Black, right? It's a transformation of what is there, right? And that it's not a surgical removal. And so sometimes a more adaptive life is spectacular. But at the very least, the goal is that if there are wounds that can't fully heal, let's say, right, that will still be able to, live in the way that we want to live, having healed our difficulties. So just a little bit about, what you might expect in with EMDR therapy. First of all, with bilateral stimulation, sometimes technology is used, a light bar or buzzies, some people call them, or just headphones, right? In order to promote the eye movements or the tactile. And just note too that, when we're doing fast bilateral, that's for reprocessing. And when we're doing slow bilateral, we actually use slow bilateral movements to help people to deepen resources. In other words, folks might do slow bilateral along with a meditation, or they might just do it on their own, right? To deepen the effects of a resource. So Shapiro said that the goal of EMDR is to rapidly metabolize the dysfunctional residue from the past and transform it into something useful. Essentially, with EMDR therapy, the dysfunctional information undergoes a spontaneous change in form and meaning, incorporating insights and affect that are enhancing rather than self-denigrating to the client. So what maybe you can hear in that, how through this process, the cognitive goes online and we're able to make meaning of things. We're able to see things from the past as having a meaning, or we have agency over all the different memories that we have combined into, the learning that helps us to move forward in our lives. We want to have comprehensive treatment effects in the shortest period of time, while maintaining client stability within a balanced system, meaning that we want it to move fast as it moves, but we also want to make sure that safety and stability is maintained. And that's why the 8 phases. So a little bit about what a session might look like, or what it is like. First of all, some sessions will look and feel like other therapy. You'll be speaking with your therapist. It'll be very relational. As I said earlier, they'll be able to help you without hearing your entire story. Your therapist will work with you on building these internal resources and skills to help you in day-to-day life, and then also to help in the reprocessing. Your EMDR therapist will collaborate with you very much on the treatment plan. Like, our goal is to give you the psychoeducation so that you feel like an expert, because we believe you are the expert on you, right? And so we want you to collaborate with us on the treatment plan. And our goal is to create a safe enough space to facilitate a process that allows for your own brain and body to heal itself. I can use the analogy, trauma, the Greek word that the word trauma comes from, the translation is actually wound, or unhealed wound, more particularly. So I like to think about it like when my daughter, very active kid, she falls down, gets her knees bloody, right? What do I do first? I kiss it. I know, right? I had pediatricians tell me it's actually kind of smart. I was like, bacteria farm, but they're like, no, it's good. And then we clean it, we cover it, right? And then eventually you have to uncover it, right? Because it needs the air, and it'll scab, maybe it'll scar, maybe it won't. I did not do anything. I provided an environment that made the possibility of the healing that the body already knows how to do, for it to do it. And that's what EMDR therapy does, right? It does that for psychological, spiritual, emotional trauma. Anyone who's experienced an adverse life event can benefit from this, and results in the alleviation of symptoms, decrease in distress from the memory, improved sense of self, resolution of present and future triggers. We've had positive therapeutic results. This list is a list where the research base is strongest. In other words, there's also other difficulties, but everything here from veterans as a population, and the different phobias and anxiety disorders, complicated grief, PTSD, dissociative disorders, performance anxiety, like non-clinical complaints also can benefit from this. People always ask, it's always many times, right? How many sessions? So all psychotherapy, it's not a prescribed number of sessions. But that being said, some of the studies have come back that fewer sessions of EMDR therapy than CBT was the comparison, that it will take fewer sessions. So just a few of the myths real quickly and start to come to a close. First of all, it's not hypnosis. People are like, follow my fingers, right? In a lot of ways, in some ways, like other therapies that it has elements of, one could say that there's a hypnotic element, but really it's far from the strongest aspect of it, and it's not hypnosis. It's not just about eye movements, which we've already talked about. It's not a pseudoscience. There's if you look up any therapy, you'll find the naysayers. And so when I say it's not a pseudoscience, I can just say that the research base is very strong. One of the myths is it makes me relive or re-experience my traumas. The fact is that other trauma therapies actually do that far more than EMDR does, right? EMDR therapy is designed to have you relive or re-experience them as little as possible and still get the relief. And the myth is, and this is understandable, it's almost not so much a myth as sort of honoring the way that the research and in the practice and the anecdotal has rolled out over time, is that it's not only for PTSD, and it's not even only for trauma or big T trauma, right? That it can be used as a primary psychotherapy for a number of things. It's not traditional talk therapy. It doesn't require talking in detail about things. And also, a lot of people are fans of this. It's not about homework. It's not a big homework therapy. And it views trauma as the root of the difficulties. So before going to questions, just a couple of things about if you're moved to investigate this further in terms of looking for a person. The EMDR International Association was established by Shapiro early on in the history of EMDR therapy and is still in place. And our recommendation is that EMDR therapy should only be offered by properly trained and licensed mental health clinicians who have been through an EMDR International Association approved training. Like, for instance, the training that we do is EMDRIA approved. We're not the only trainers out there. There's probably about 50 training organizations that are approved by EMDRIA in the country. And then if you're looking for an EMDR therapist, one place to look or start to look is the Find a Therapist tool with emdria.org. As you're looking for an EMDR therapist, you can put filters in, like for specializations. There are filters in for level of training. Like some folks are just trained, they're trained to the foundational level, like they've taken the training that makes it so they can say, I am an EMDR therapist. And some folks go through further training. So if you're looking for someone in your area who's gone that extra mile, you can put that filter in too. So I wanted to leave enough time for questions. And I'll also say thank you. And these are phrases, loving kindness phrases. There's many different variations on this. These are the ones that I'm familiar with from my friend Sharon Salzberg. May you be free from fear. May you be healed. May you be happy. May you be at ease. So I'm going to stop the share. I'll be glad to put it back up if you need something from it, or if you need me to reference something from it, and invite your questions. And thank you so much for being here tonight. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was a lot of information. I think it was really well done, and you're a delightful speaker. It's great.
Wonderful, very much.
We have a few questions that have already come through, and I'll direct them to Steve, and as more come through, we'll see those too. Somebody very early on asked, is there a known success rate, not even sure how that would be defined, for EMDR therapy?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it is one of those things, right? Like when you look at the research period, right, around psychotherapy, you see a lot of qualitative research, right, and a lot of quantitative research with the numbers and the success rates. And so the best way I can put it is that World Health Organization declaring it evidence-based for PTSD in 2013 was a big deal, in that was, a major health body sort of looking at the literature and the practice up until this point, and seeing that the success rate indicated that they and other bodies would say, hey, if you have PTSD in particular, you really should go this direction. And then the other sort of basis for that in that same area is how the VA and the branches of the military, when we're talking about PTSD in particular, that there is, it's been growing and growing over the last decade. My cousin Cindy, who I used to play basketball with, and she used to throw elbows, sand. She just retired after 39 years in the military. She was a brigadier general, and she was the first female academic dean of West Point Academy. She led West Point through the pandemic, and so she's allowed to throw elbows playing basketball. Anyway, she can do what she wants. But in any case, I was able to, have a relationship with West Point's mental health system. And then there's been a couple of military veterans who became EMDR therapists who were deep in those communities and were able to establish, a solid research and anecdotal base as to the success of EMDR therapy. And then on the anecdotal side, I don't know why I'm going towards this veteran issue, but a couple of the centers that I used to work at, and one that I was clinical director at, we got we got TRICARE contracts, right? And that's the insurance for active duty and for families of active duty. And the success rate at those treatment centers was great. So so again, it's about, you know, like, yeah, exactly. How do you measure that? I can tell you that my experience has been that in my own office and the offices of my consultees and the offices of my trainees, I've trained over 1,000 EMDR therapists at this point. They just keep coming back with, oh my gosh, you know.
Great. It's good to know. We had another question. Does EMDR therapy work when a person is triggered by particular situations but does not remember the original event?
Yes. Great question. And I'll take you back to phase 1 and 2, right? Where the reason why we say that you don't have to tell us your whole story is because there's a good chance that you don't know your whole story, right? And so the history-taking protocols are designed to help us to get at enough of what has happened in the past to give us a starting point. Like all we need is a portal into it. Like that example I gave earlier, that thing that happened when I was 12, right? And then let's say there's a whole bunch of other memories, you know, in that phase 1 history. And then we decide together, okay, it's time to start these reprocessing phases together. And I might say, which memory do you want to start with? And if they say the thing that happened when I was 12, then I'm not quite sure about it, but you know, it's the thing that happened. We can start there. Because we'll just activate that as it's remembered now. And then the combination of the other elements of the therapy will start to bring more of it to bear, right? So.
Okay. All right. Are there certain diagnoses that should not try EMDR therapy? And if they do try it, are there precautions that should be taken? Or?
So this is the good news about our having this conversation in 2022, because so much more research and practice has gone on outside of PTSD over the last 10, 15 years. And there are journal articles and also book-length treatments of just about every diagnosis that you could think of. So the conversation used to be more about, you know, which diagnoses would you not, or would you, you know, hesitate or refer out. Now it's more about how much longer might it take to get to the reprocessing phases with particular, right? So when the clinician is looking at it through the lens of a complete psychotherapy, then I'm not thinking, oh, I won't be able to do this in total. I'll just be thinking about what are the things, the different aspects that I might have to highlight or take out in order to work with that. And also, just as one example, I'll give you is I worked at a clinic out here in LA for 3 years that was mental health primary, and had many clients with psychotic disorders and bipolar, both 1 and 2. And, you know, so I was doing EMDR therapy with that population, and it worked very well. One of the things that, one of the ways that you can frame it is any amount of relief for the traumatic aspects of whatever a person has gone through is going to help in treating anything and everything else that might be present. Right?
You can see that. What about something somebody specifically asked? What about anorexia?
So you might have on the sheet of that which has been well documented in terms of the difficulties that are treated well by EMDR therapy. Eating disorders are one, including anorexia. Great. And I can give you an example there too. I have a clinic that I work with out here in Claremont, which is outside LA. That's an eating disorder clinic. That's all levels of care, residential all the way to outpatient. And they're using EMDR therapy as their primary therapy, as the system that I've outlined goes. And again, it's that kind of thing. Like, for instance, with anorexia, obviously there's often a very difficult medical component to the consequences or the aspects of, right? And so that center sees that medical aspect as part of through the lens of the 8-phase protocol. What resources does this person need on the medical side, on the changing behaviors around eating side, around all the different aspects of what they need to stabilize and prepare to then do the trauma work, which then oftentimes there's a lot in the literature too about the relationship between eating disorders and trauma, particularly developmental trauma. So
thank you. Somebody else has asked, do I need to be in another form of therapy during the EMDR work, or is there traditionally or usually ongoing therapy afterwards?
Great question. There's two different ways that EMDR therapy might be delivered, right? Sometimes it's delivered in treatment center setting, so obviously it's part of a number of different modalities. And then many times people will seek adjunctive EMDR therapy while being in another therapy context. And going back to what I was talking about before, is that EMDR therapy is a complete psychotherapy. So folks can also just seek EMDR therapy as their therapy experience. And so then I can use my own practice as an example. I do have this experience of many of my clients, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I have shorter engagements with my clients than I did before I had EMDR therapy as my primary therapy. And then I do have my clients who, after they've, basically, they're feeling better around the past, present, and future, but they still want to have a therapist. And so they'll continue on with me. The goal is that the client will know best what they need, having completed a course of EMDR therapy as their ongoing sustainable recovery.
I see it as they've graduated from EMDR therapy, but they keep on going to other forms of therapy with you, perhaps.
Yeah, in a sense, that's how it can go. Yeah.
Okay, I'm seeing there was another question or two here, and I'm afraid they're only coming to me again. Somebody's asked, how does EMDR therapy treat adoption trauma?
Yeah. So as I was saying earlier about we need a portal, right? So oftentimes, and also the fact that we don't need to know the whole story in order to help the person is helpful in that regard, because many times there might be missing information about self or experience. And so it pretty much treats it similarly to how it would treat other early childhood trauma, which is to just get the history, find the events and the relationships that feed the ongoing difficulties, and then do the reprocessing from there. So and you raise a great issue. One of the things that, again, the 2022, there's a number of books, articles, and for clinicians, advanced topic CE courses around adoption trauma in particular, along with other populations and difficulties.
Okay. I think that we've asked most of the questions here. I guess one of the questions had been, but I think you've answered this in your presentation, are there variations in the EMDR therapy techniques based on the diagnosis or the issues? And
I could say a little bit more about that.
that'd be great.
Yeah, in as much as, so for instance, the way our team trains our clinicians, we basically say, if you get this 8-phase protocol down, if you're able to get the standard protocol down, you're going to be able to point it at most issues, if not all. And then you have the option of, because EMDRIA and the definition of EMDR calls for modification and adaptation. So there's a number of other specialty protocols that are out there. For instance, there's protocols for addiction, there's protocols for chronic pain, there's protocols for OCD, anxiety disorders. And what these are most of these alternative protocols don't do much of a change to to Shapiro's special sauce. They mostly help a person to conceptualize the case, and then also possibly the way they might set up the target for reprocessing. Like with chronic pain, instead of looking at the elements of the event, we'll be looking at the elements of the pain, right? With addiction, sometimes there's an alternative protocol developed by that person I said, who was the first person who ever, Shapiro ever waved her fingers in front of, A.J. Popke, who passed away last year. He wrote an addiction protocol called the Desensitization of Triggers and Urge Reduction Protocol. So this is a protocol where, let's say a client comes into my office whose addiction is one of the things that we're dealing with. And they say to me something like, I don't want to look at my trauma right now. All I can think about is using. I just want to get high. I can say, oh, do you want to do the detour? It's called detour, the detour protocol. And so then what we do is we point the desensitization and the reprocessing at that urge. And we're able to give symptom reduction for that, which again, keeps us in the EMDR therapy sort of model. And it also gives them the symptom relief that they need to be able to keep on keeping on and, continue to reprocess their trauma. So yeah, so there's modifications. There for clinicians, there's books about this thick, about 5 of them with alternative protocols. Right. So yes, so there's different approaches.
Another question came up just now. Is there a difference in the research between the eye movement and the tactile and the audio work, or do they seem to work the same?
So the research on the eye movements is deeper over the years, because Shapiro, being a research person, said, if you would please keep as many of the elements the same as we go forward as a research community. And she said, so if you could do eye movements in every time. So a lot of the research was there. So there's been a lot more research over the last number of years over the efficacy of the tactile and the audio tones. And there's some indication that the way that the eyes are wired to the brain is different than the audio and the tactile, but not enough to indicate that. And then looking at the results of studies that look at people using the tactile and using the audio are, similar. And so one of the things that our team is passionate about is that we believe that more important than which one of those 3 is better is when we give clients the choice of which one to use, that's the one that's going to work. Right? And that's the other thing, is that some people, the eye movement's tricky because some people don't have the eye strength to be able to do it, right? So if that was the truth, we'd be kind of in trouble, right? And so you'll see a lot of, I don't know if any of you saw the Prince Harry and Oprah 4-part special on mental health. It was on Apple TV. I think you can still access it if you like. Prince Harry got EMDR therapy on camera, and he was using the self-tapping method, right, to get the therapy. And so a vast majority of sessions are done with either audio tones or tactile. Right. So. Okay.
Here's a good general question. Somebody says, how do you convince someone with an eating disorder, but it could be with any issue, to try EMDR? Like when their primary therapist may be doing CBT therapy and says it's not necessary. We as family members are often the ones advocating for our loved ones to enter into some form of therapy. So That's a good NAMI question, I think.
Yes, yes, and just so you know, it's a great question in terms of my life's work, which is, you know, to help people to find their way here, right? In addition to getting the benefits of it once they're there. And so a big part of what we do in the therapy itself is this psychoeducation about the how trauma works, and trauma works on the brain, and a little bit about what I spoke about, the 3 parts of the brain, you know, the neocortex, right? And so coming to someone, to a loved one, and saying, well, you know, in talk therapy and CBT and talk therapy, we're working cognitive brain to cognitive brain, right? But the problem is trapped, not there, right? The problem is in the emotional system and limbic system and or the body. So we need to find a way to talk to that part of the person. And EMDR therapy does that. And the bilateral stimulation helps to get that started. And sort of pointing folks towards whatever the literature, like even the body keeps the score, right? Like anything that helps a person to see that we need to treat the whole person. So it's, you know, it's almost, I almost feel like let's do another hour and a half just on it, right? Because
Part 2.
Exactly. No, but just, you know, it's sort of the nature of informal intervention, you know, so thanks for the question. I hope that little bit was helpful.
Yeah, it's often an issue. Well, we like to start and stop on time. It is 8:30. So mostly I want to say thank you, Dr. Dansiger. Thank you, everybody who's joined us tonight. We will have a recording on our website. It'll take us a bit technologically to get there, but it will be there. And so people who have missed, if you've enjoyed this and you know somebody else who, you know, maybe you want your loved one to see this so that they can learn about the 3 parts of the brain, it will be up there for them. So that will be helpful. And we really appreciate you allowing us to record it.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you.
And that's it. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.